So Terman proceeds to recruit some people. This fund from Thomas Welton Stanford allowed him to do that. So he essentially said, I need a general experimental psychologist. And he went and recruited a guy named Walter Miles, who was a very distinguished experimental psychologist, and he kind of liked fussing with equipment. And that's kind of what those guys did. Miles led the experimental program. I might say that prior to getting Miles, Terman had tried for a year to recruit his best friend in psychology, Edwin G. Boring, who, I mean, don't take that name seriously. I always thought it was a pretty good book that Boring wrote on the history of psychology. But then when the Clark department was collapsing, Boring was looking for a job, and I think he was tempted to come here until Harvard offered him a job, and then being a New Englander, he didn't move. So Miles comes, then he wants somebody to work in something other than straight experimental, so he hires a guy named Calvin Stone, who was a PhD of Carl Lashley's and was an animal behavior guy, and really quite a productive guy. And Stone came here and spent the rest of his career here. Miles left eventually to go to Yale. And when Miles left, Terman hired Jack Hilgard. Now, it's going to, everybody in this room probably, or most people here, knew Jack Hilgard, and it's kind of almost eerie to realize that the guy we knew was the second guy in the whole shebang in regard to the program. So now we have a program or a department of Terman, Walter Miles, and Calvin Stone. Terman then appoints in 1923 E.K. Strong, who was going to represent sort of applied psychology, and that's what Strong was and did. And E.K. Strong is, of course, the guy who eventually developed the vocational interest test, which lots of high school kids take and then worry about what they're going to do with themselves. And that is the department. Then, in 1923, to have something in clinical, he hires a woman named Maud Merrill, who later married a judge named James, and Maud Merrill James, and they live. Anybody remember where the Farnsworths lived? Where David Kennedy lives now. They lived in that house next door to the what I'll call the Kennedy house. And I might say Walter Miles built the home that the space the dean of the law school lived in, at least when we lived over in that area on Girona Road. Beautiful house. Those houses were built, by the way, for $7,000 to $8,000. Hard to believe. Okay, so now in 1923, he has a complete little staff. They're now beginning to train some graduate students. And in 1925, they decided they needed another young man, and they hired a young Ohio State PhD named Paul Farnsworth, who many of us worked with. Miles leaves for Yale to go back to New Haven, and This is a terrible listing of names coming and going, and I'm sorry, but that's kind of what the story was. Miles goes back to Yale, and so Terman hired a young Yale PhD named Jack Hilgard, Ernest R. Hilgard, who came here in 1933 and was a professor in the psychology department, and then eventually was dean of the graduate school for a while, and did all sorts of things as a good citizen of this university. The other thing Terman did was to say we probably ought to have someone who's going to teach some statistics. And he hired a fellow named Truman Kelly, who was one of the early explorers of factor analysis and was pertinent in the department. And when he finally decided to go to Harvard, his student, Quinn McNamara, was appointed to be the department statistician and to teach the courses in statistics. Now, a little story that I didn't realize, but in 1932, Hilgard isn't going to arrive for a year, and so Terman has an open spot, and he hires, I hadn't realized it, he hires a German expatriate named Kurt Lewin. And I had known that, but I had the feeling that Levine, if you will, was around in the institutions in the later 40s, but this was early, and this must have been the first job Lewin got in this country. He was terribly pleased that they made him an acting professor, because all he'd been in Germany was an Außerordentlicher professor, which is not quite the full thing. And he was here for a year and then left to go to Cornell. There was a period there where American academics, without much financial support, were hoking up jobs for the German expatriates, and they kind of had to wander around and have all sorts of visiting type appointments. So Lewin was here. Now, just a word about that. I think it's the Times, but Terman and 4 of his appointees, Hilgard, McNamara, Miles, and Stone, those 4 guys and Terman were all elected at one time or another president of the American Psychological Association. Now, this was back in the days when that was the only association we had. Now, the last person in the department to be elected president of that is sitting here. It's Phil. And probably he is the last ever, because it's become such a big, hard to deal with organization. This is the beginning of psychology dividing itself between experimental psychology, what we all know, and then applied clinical psychology. Okay? Now, if you'll stay awake a little bit more, say a word about some things that Terman did in regard to the regular stuff. He needed somebody to teach child psychology, so he hired a woman named Lois Stoltz, who came here quite reluctantly, but then settled in and spent the rest of her career here teaching courses in child psychology. Alberta Siegel, who many of you knew, was a student of Lois Stoltz's. A second guy that I had not heard of, who was here for 2 years as a psychical research fellow, his name was Charles Stewart. And he was a guy who was apparently quite clever at setting up situations and running enough subjects so he'd get some sort of results and creating sort of after-the-fact hypotheses about them. Not uncommon. Stewart, after 2 years here, went back to Duke, and everybody said when he died he was going to get in touch with Rhine, and apparently never did. Hilgard, when he became dean of the graduate division, said he wasn't going to be chair of the department anymore, and they needed to get a new chair, and they did. In 1953, Robert R. Sears came out from Harvard. Bob Sears, who many of you knew, was a Stanford undergraduate. His father had been a professor here, and he was back as head of the child development program at Harvard when he was recruited back to head up the department. And I would say that he created the department that we all know. I think Sears had a marvelous sense of academic intellectual quality. He was on occasion a bit of a character, but that's all right. He was married to a bit of a character. He came here as head, and one of the first things he did was to say, we're going to need some development in social psychology. And if you'll go to page, see which page? Ah, yes. The page that's got Jack Hilgard on the upper left and this young kid on the right. Where they got that picture of Leon Festinger, I don't know. But how they got Leon to pose for a picture, I don't know. But there he is, absolutely magically effective and interesting researcher. On occasion, kind of difficult, but was responsible for a lot of what we know of in our present department. I, as a brand new chairman, we had somebody that left in our, we had a sort of burgeoning make-believe clinical program, and we said we need somebody who's going to provide some intellectual leadership there. And so I rode around and Leon rode around, and we finally hired Walter Michel, who some of you know, who is kind of hard to recognize. He seems to have lost all his hair here. I'm going to say a word about what I think's been going on. Am I badly over time? I am wandering a little. It's been a long day for me. I think two things went on that are to be pointed out. One, I think psychology was a growth stock all around American academia. Many of the institutions that you all went to as undergraduates really just got psychology departments as Stanford did, and then they blossomed and bloomed. So I don't think there was anything special about it, except Terman clearly rode that wave. And then Sears, to his enduring credit, managed to kind of keep the